Well, good afternoon to all of you, and really thank you to the Center for Migration and International Relations for organizing this, and to all the fantastic speakers that we have. Mr. Rajimon, thank you for sharing your insights in the case of India, Nizar Ahmed for Pakistan, and Mamoon for Bangladesh, and all the sorry organizers for this event. So let me look at the Philippine Gulf and then look at the Gulf and sending countries very, very quickly, because I know we don't have a lot of time. So this crisis, I mean, it's an exceptional crisis, wrapped in an exceptional moment. And if you look at various crises in the region in the past, a lot of these occurred within national or regional context. And it's not, in a global context like this, where a lot of states are forced to deal with their foreign migrant populations outside and also their domestic populations, right? So it's a public health issue, as Regimon pointed out. It's a security, it's economic, and also foreign policy. So it's wrapped around these issues that affects all of them. So in the case of Philippines, we have about 100 million Filipinos inside the country. And we also have roughly 10 million outside. So if you look at our fiscal budget, it's very low, right? It's not really conducive to handle such massive crisis. So our repatriation, to give you a short answer, repatriation process towards the Gulf is not very different, from India, Pakistan, or Bangladesh. So this crisis, it appears to be a force majeure crisis because, it's an extraordinary crisis that, a lot of states, they think, the states sending, receiving countries, or even employers, it's sort of beyond their control. And that raises a lot of issues in terms of who pays, who bears the cost. So for Gulf countries, they're saying no. So they've, adopted different repatriation models. You can see Bahrain and Kuwait. So it's amnesty, short-term amnesty mechanisms. Kuwait is paying, Bahrain, not really. And and then other countries like UAE, Saudi, and Oman, etc., workers will be mandated to pay, right? In theory, should be employers if you look at their Gulf labor laws. But then, as Regimon pointed out, they're quite quick to react and quite quick to shift the responsibility to sending states and workers. So as a result, they ended up revising their labor laws. UAE did that, right? To shift sort of the pressure. So a lot of workers, they end up taking that responsibility and the sending country. So in the case of Philippines, they ended up, dealing with all these issues of repatriation. So we have about 2.3 million legally and 3 million Filipinos, including undocumented ones, in the Gulf countries. Now, the Philippine government strategy at the moment is to repatriate. It's a mixture of repatriation and social amelioration, short term, meaning offering cash, as our colleague from Bangladesh is basically doing. So they're offering $200, right, and some free food to migrant workers. So what the Philippine embassy is doing at the moment in the Gulf countries is to prioritize cases. So when I say prioritize, I'm referring to undocumented, stranded workers, or those workers in vulnerable conditions, meaning those pregnant Filipino workers, senior citizens, those aging migrants, those workers with pre-existing health conditions, and those workers where they just don't have the money anymore, or even employer or agency to help them pay for that cost. So that's how we actually prioritize, right, repatriation in the case of the Philippines across the Gulf countries. Now, remember, Philippine migration is a global one. So currently, the Department of Foreign Affairs budget, it's mainly used for Filipinos who are from Europe, migrating from Europe, not even Middle East, because a lot of Filipinos, in comparison to Pakistan and India, they also want to stay. So for example, in the case of UAE, when the UAE said, consult with your embassies and go home, less than 1,000 Filipinos asked to be repatriated. Remember, we have 800,000 Filipinos in the UAE. Only less than 1,000 asked that. Pakistan, it's 47,000, right? So you could clearly see who wants to stay and who wants to return. In the case of Filipinos, remember, you also have to understand the sectoral distribution, right? So in the UAE, we're more diverse, right? So the effects are very different. So we have a lot of nurses, and domestic workers. And these are the kind of sectors that will actually be required in the local market versus those in other sectors like hospitality, construction. I mean, the construction ones for the Expo and Qatar World Cup, sure, these things will continue, and you might see some layoffs or a lot of layoffs, but these things will persist. But in the context of hotel industries, there's a lot of massive unemployment. But when Gulf countries are starting to convert quarantine spaces, hotels into quarantine spaces, the cleaning industry actually booms, right? It creates a separate kind of demand. So it shifts the demand within sort of the country. So sectoral distribution is very interesting because it affects how the Philippine government and other standing countries approaches which Gulf countries are more difficult to deal with, right? So in the case of Kuwait, for example, we didn't have a lot of tough time because the majority of our workers there are domestic workers and nurses, and they're both needed by local Kuwaiti employers and the public health and private health institutions in Kuwait, but not in the UAE where there's a huge, and Qatar, there's a huge, manufacturing, there's a huge service sector, hospitality sector. So that actually creates a huge, huge problem. So again, the point that I'm making here is that we have to look at sort of the sectoral breakdown, the demand that's being shifted at the moment locally, and the categories of OFWs or Filipinos or Indians, Pakistanis that you see within the Gulf. So what are the Filipino workers are facing? So there are three kinds of Filipino workers at the moment, right, in the Gulf. So you have the unemployed ones, the fully unemployed, and then the partially unemployed, the no work, no pay, right? Because in the Gulf, specifically in UAE, 30% of workforce are allowed to work. So there's partial easing. I think Regimon talked about how lockdowns could extend pain and suffering to migrant workers. And that's exactly what's happening in Kuwait and Saudi. So these lockdowns are disrupting workers' access to employment, both in the formal and informal market. So there's unemployed Filipinos, stranded Filipinos, those with tourist visas or visa visas, business visas, student visas, they're all stuck. And those undocumented before the COVID, right? So how is the Philippine government dealing with all this? Well, as I said, they're focusing on those stranded and undocumented and those vulnerable ones. Those who's excluded from the free ticket from the Philippine government? Well, those who are under no work, no pay. And that is a big political debate right now in the Philippines because they're struggling to access these free tickets and it's not free. And Filipinos are saying, okay, we want to access this too because the Philippine rule is saying you should not have an employer to access a free ticket. But the problem is, how are you going to do that when you have no work, no pay? You still have an employer, yet he's not paying you. So therefore you're excluded. So that's actually a big tension right now, big politics, Yeah, even in the Philippines. Workers' issues, it's mainly rent at the moment, right? Those who stay, it's rent and the remittance. The rents remain high, the cost is still high, so then the salaries are low or massively reduced. So you end up with a population that's very vulnerable and there's nothing that they can do about it because Gulf countries are very protective of the real estate, right? Because these real estates, they generate a lot of income for local, populations. It's a direct income and they have to protect the value of the real estate. That's why they're doing that. Cost of living is going up. So you see a lot of policies like the VAT. So these things will have long-term effect, but they clearly are sending a message that workers should go home, right? And they need to go home. And you can definitely see VAT policies changing very soon, not just from the UAE, but also from other Gulf countries, because it's something that's what they're trying to do. Very quickly, because I know we don't have a lot of time. When it comes to state policy, what exactly are they doing to respond to tension? They ended up creating an interagency unit. So in the Philippines, they combine the foreign affairs, labor affairs, health affairs department, and so it's a combination of all these, major industry institutions in the Philippines. So you have an interagency. This agency determines how many Filipino workers can be repatriated, right? So at the moment, they're only allowing 400. And remember, we have 3 million from the Middle East. And this creates massive tension because from the Philippine side, what they're saying, look, we have 100 million here in the Philippines. We don't have a lot of quarantine facilities. We don't have enough budget. We cannot accept any, like any more than like 400. That's the maximum. And remember, states have to operate within constraints. You have to define your limits, right? So the proportion is 400, and that's a big problem because when the Philippine government shuts down the airport, it creates major diplomatic tension because it creates massive tension because it's 400, and so this is from the Philippine side. From the diplomatic side, it's a big problem because they want to repatriate, right? Yet they couldn't do it because, first of all, there are Filipinos in Asia, Singapore, in Europe, right, in Africa, in Latin America. So it's a big sort of global tension because if I'm an ambassador in the UAE, I can't easily prioritize my interest because I have to deal with other countries too, right? So they create an interagency unit. It's a mixture of response. So they're offering free tickets, as I said, and the social amelioration for those who actually want to stay. And then, okay, so capacities, as I talked about that, because we have land-based and sea-based. We have a lot of seamen. So that actually creates issues. So when you look at quarantine in the Philippines, if you're, we converted ships into quarantine areas. That's for seamen, right? And then we also converted these, public infrastructures into healthcare, quarantine areas. And it's a big problem because if you're a legal migrant, it's free. It's paid by the government. But if you migrated on a tourist visa, you pay, right? And that creates a lot of tension. You pay in terms of the testing and the quarantine. So that creates a lot of tension right now because the state selectively protects and extends assistance. So that would be an interesting case for Nepal if they would do that. Two more things. One is on fiscal policy. The question is, who can actually afford, right, the repatriation and the public health spectrum? So in the case of the Philippines, they've been aggressive in terms of taxation, and it's creating a lot of backfire, tension from a lot of Filipinos everywhere, because they cannot use their sovereign wealth funds. They cannot borrow any more money because their economic grade has been downgraded already. They cannot take out more loans. They're not receiving a lot of foreign aid, except from the World Bank. They did, but that's still very limited. And they cannot impose taxes on the oligarchs because investments will fly right away. So they're basically caught. It's like a checkmate, right? So don't think that the Philippines is like the best model, right? Because I can tell you it's not. It's pretty much the same, because I think you guys are in the same boat too, in Pakistan, Bangladesh, and India. But I think the degree of proactiveness, I think that's the kind of, that would, slightly make them different. And the last thing is actually fear, the issue of fear. I think when I say fear, I'm referring to the image of the state, right? Because for a long time, Philippines has been touted as the leading sort of standing state model, yet it faces all these issues and it disaggregates, unpacks all its, limitations. As I said, it's an exceptional crisis placed in an exceptional moment. And recommendations for Nepal, okay, I have 4 things very quickly. One, on data, very important. You have to look at your data, sectoral distribution, right? And the Gulf policies data, because you could easily tell, right, which ones to cooperate faster, right, depending on that. Because each Gulf countries, they have different degrees of receptiveness, right? So Kuwait is actually slightly different. Remember, they have more cash, so they tend to pay for free tickets. We don't know when they will extend that amnesty. UAE is a little bit different. I think they do expect employers to actually pay. And I think that's going to create a lot of tension, especially in the long run, because a lot of them have revised their labor law, and they really expect workers to pay, not the employer. Because a lot of employers argue, based on my interviews, that they've run out of cash. And usually they include the ticket from the gratuity from the end of service. Some workers are aware of it and some aren't. So they're shifting it there. That's one. 2 is prioritization. So Nepal has to be very, very has to be very strategic in terms of controlling the Nepali workers and families' expectations. You have to prioritize the most vulnerable ones, right? The stranded, undocumented, women, pregnant women, Nepalis with pre-existing conditions, mental health, etc. That's why the role of embassies and functions are very, very important. So you have to like really put it out there. That's exactly what is the Philippine government is doing. And they're also facing challenges because there's a blame game between the central office, right, the Department of Foreign Affairs, Department of Labor in the Philippines, and the diplomatic mission. So the political packaging, political message has to be very, very tight and very clear, actually, in this matter, because it's a real test of legitimacy, right, whether a state like Nepal can actually extend protection at this point in time. Coordination is the biggest problem, because what happens in the case of Philippines, a lot of politicians, they overpromise. And yet when they promise, the budget has not been sent to the diplomatic missions, right? There's like 2 weeks delay, 3 weeks delay, and all of a sudden, all Filipinos are swarming sort of the diplomatic missions, you know, demanding, where's my $200, where's my free food, etc. So senior officials in home countries, they need to make sure that when the moment they open their mouths in terms of protecting, you know, and delivering these things, the budget has already been allocated, right, or in the hands of the ambassador or the labor attaché, etc. So that's very, very important. Coordination. I think when I say coordination, I'm referring to diplomatic missions, Department of Health, Foreign Affairs, Labor, and the Bureau of Immigration in the Philippines, or in any Senate descending country. Lastly, they need to look at, funds. So now the funds, there's a lot of, you know, Filipino groups and other groups are demanding for transparency in funding. So that fund needs to be very, very explicitly mentioned to people. Because in the case of Philippines, we have, if it's pandemic, it's the foreign affairs, right, responsibility, right? So it falls under them. So they actually pay. So we have about $20 million, right? That's a billion pesos. And I can guarantee you it's not enough, because the projected number of unemployed Filipinos would be 2.3 million, according to the Department of Labor. So that's very high. That's not going to be enough. So transparency of funding is very, very important. And I think the Philippines is a little bit different because we're going to have an election in 2 years. So a lot of politicians are also trying to play this game because, you know, all of W's are, Filipinos are a good political object. Lastly, what I'm trying to say is they have to communicate. And I think if Nepal wants to govern this slightly better than other sending countries, they really need to be honest to their people. Anyhow, that's the contribution I'd like. The question about like, can you negotiate, right? At the moment, there's no negotiation, right? So a lot of sending countries are not, like, can I repeat that? There are no negotiations, right? All states are unilaterally acting, right, based on their national interests. So they haven't really utilized regional consultative platforms like Colombo Process, Abu Dhabi Dialogue. They're still quiet about it. So I think sending countries like India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Philippines, they really need to start mobilizing their Colombo process, because I think it's about time that they use it, right, vis-a-vis Gulf countries. Thank you. Yeah.